Welcome. Today we will explore how our design in Brightspace supported the three essential elements of the community of inquiry framework: cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence through learner interactions and media-rich content. Intentional design for online engagement is critical for deep learning. We'll showcase strategies and examples from several of our university's fully online academic programs that promoted engagement through interaction with content, peers, and instructors. The presentation will feature examples in Brightspace and other technologies and lessons learned along the way.
We'd like to start by situating ourselves and honoring the land we are currently on. McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which we meet today. So I'd like to start by introducing the instructional designers who are part of our conversation today. We have Theo, who worked on cybersecurity, and Kirsti and Naomi, and myself, who worked on the nursing program. As members of McGill University's online programs portfolio team, we designed and developed two fully online academic programs at our university: an undergraduate nursing program and a graduate cybersecurity program. This discussion today will be of interest to instructional designers, developers, and instructors, either with an interest in online course design or looking to extend their use of Brightspace functionality for teaching. For the nursing program, one of the challenges we faced was taking an existing on-campus program that uses lecture-based and applied courses, such as labs, and redesigning this to a competency-based online program. This required us to rethink how students would acquire knowledge and skills, collaborate, and engage in practice activities. So Theo, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the challenges you were faced with cybersecurity?
In designing the cybersecurity program, we had a different challenge. It was how to condense large amounts of information into 8-week modules that offered flexible learning to graduate students, many of whom are already professionals working in the field. So these are all original courses that were specifically designed for McGill, and with so many different and similar offerings out there, we had to do a number of things to make our courses unique and valuable for students. In many ways, what we had to stretch the limits of the LMS and to use all available tools for asynchronous and synchronous learning, and also included a lot of rich content from third-party providers and developed some ourselves. Our strategy was to place an accent on storytelling. We adopted a perspective of peeling back the curtain and revealing to the students the inner workings of cybersecurity, thus engaging them more intimately into the learning process.
Thanks for that, Theo. So just to frame the presentation today, we will be having a conversation style dialogue, and we're going to be asking and answering questions to each other, really focusing on 3 areas of intentional design. So interaction with content, interaction with peers, and interaction with the instructors. We're going to speak based on our experience, but also provide some examples.
So before we actually start the discussion, here's an overview of the theoretical foundations that we keep coming back to during our instructional design process. So we consider the community of inquiry by Garrison, Anderson, and Archer when we start designing a course to ensure that we cater to the social, cognitive, and teaching presences. We also keep in mind Moore's 3 learner interactions. So the interaction between the learner and the content, between the learner and the instructor, and between the learners themselves. So we use this to promote engagement within the 3 presences of the community of inquiry. Finally, when designing instructional media, we apply Mayer's multimedia principles. We found these 3 pillars to be foundational in guiding our design decisions and to support engagement and the cognitive processes for deep learning. At the end of the video, we've added our references, so if you're interested in looking into this a little more deeply, you can do so.
Okay, so let's dive into the conversation with our first prompt focused on students' interaction with content. So our question is, what was a complex challenge that you faced, and how did you redesign for engagement with content online?
We noticed after bringing our ideas together that we had 3 main categories of engagement strategies that we wanted to showcase. So asynchronous simulations, synchronous simulations, and media-rich content. And to start off the discussion and the conversation, I'll hand it over to Naomi, and so she can talk about asynchronous simulations.
Thanks so much, Diane. Yes, I'd love to share an example of an asynchronous strategy that supported students' meaningful engagement with the course content. So the challenge was to recreate a nursing health and physical assessment course, which was traditionally held in a lab setting, where students could develop their clinical competencies, but with the maximum of flexibility for an online course. So since we're talking about applied skills, we were really looking for a simulation software that would support this application of their knowledge. And we ended up reviewing a number of options, but settled on an off-the-shelf health simulation software called Shadow Health. So let me explain this software just a little bit to you. With this simulation, students work independently. So they work through a thematic simulation. They're interacting with an avatar patient, and this patient has a very rich backstory and health history.
Hi, Tina.
Not every student's going to have the same experience because the data collected really depends on the questions that the students ask.
My name is Naomi, and I'll be your nurse today. How are you feeling this morning?
So in fact, you'll see that the simulation is conversation driven, and it's not a kind of click and select interaction format.
I'm feeling a little better since my foot's been getting taken care of.
There's this free-form question sequencing, and it uses speech to text. So it also encourages students to use timely empathy and insert patient education. And these were really some of the features that we felt were important in the selection of the software. It really aligned with the course learning outcomes. And we actually reviewed multiple options, really comparing them on about 20 different data points. In addition, of course, to the alignment with the course outcomes, looking at the depth of the individual feedback that the software provided on the student's performance. And something that I also want to emphasize with the intentional design is this wasn't a standalone strategy. So it was a simulation that they did independently, but then students came together on a discussion forum to debrief their experience with the simulation. And it also was then built upon by a further step where they did some pure practice activities, but I think I might speak to that a little bit more later.
On the other hand, we, for another course, which was the nursing practicum course in critical care, myself and the two instructors designed and developed a virtual gaming simulation to accompany students during their internship in critical care. So traditionally, students do this simulation or used to do this simulation in the on-campus lab with a live standardized patient or an actor acting as a patient, basically. And during the pandemic, the nursing school switched to using Zoom with a proxy nurse in the lab to do these simulations, to conduct these simulations. The instructor, however, felt that not all students were as engaged in the interview process as she would like. So what we decided to do was design an asynchronous, self-paced virtual simulation to allow all students to engage in the clinical decision-making process. So the objective of the virtual simulation is for students to respond to a critical cardiac respiratory issue. Students are presented with a patient case where the patient presents themselves to the emergency room with symptoms, and the patient goes through different stages of deterioration up until CPR and resuscitation. So students need to recognize the signs and respond to them with appropriate interventions.
So you've all shared examples of asynchronous simulations, but I have an example from nursing's inquiry-based learning courses that's a bit different. So inquiry-based, or we call them IBL courses, are different from theory courses because students explore a series of patient cases. That's what the whole course is based on. And they follow a structured, guided process to identify and fill knowledge gaps. That's the core of the course. And so through this process, they work both independently and collaboratively. They conduct research, they gather data, they reflect. What really brings the content to life and pushes students to engage is the synchronous telehealth simulations, which are part of each scenario. So like I said, a little bit different. As Diane already mentioned, this is another case where it's patient actors that they're interacting with. It's all done via video conference. And the end result is that even from behind their screens, students get an opportunity to interact with a patient and further build their skills and knowledge. So that's a slightly different example, but sort of still in the simulation realm, but involves real time.
And might I add and jump in and add that I think the other advantage too is that as compared to predetermined simulation, the actor responds depending, right, on how students are speaking to them or treating them or that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the actors are given like a script and a sort of a set of responses, but yes, you're right. It's the content actually interacts back.
So yeah, we've been talking a lot about simulations, both the asynchronous and the synchronous examples that everybody's brought to the table. But I don't want to forget about some other examples of intentional rich media content. So an example that comes to mind for me was, again, in the health assessment course, it also covered anatomy. So again, the challenge was taking an on-campus course where students had access to 3D, life-size anatomical models in the lab setting, and providing that experience to students in their individual settings in a way that they could interact and still kind of grasp the knowledge that comes with exploration of anatomy, understanding, how everything fits together, what the, surrounding tissues and structures are for any given anatomical structure. So we ended up using and actually integrating directly into the content pages a software called Anatomy TV from Primal Pictures. It was actually a resource that our library already had available as an external software. But again, we were able to embed these interactive 3D anatomical models. And we really thought about where we placed it within the content. So it started off with a really mini lecture by the instructor using the software to demonstrate some key points that would be relevant for the students' physical assessment process. So this helped to, I think, really motivate students because it highlighted the relevance of what they were learning. And then right below that was the embedded interactive 3D model. And it was kind of structured in that we selected the particular view so that students were looking already at the specific body site or region that they needed to explore. And then we also asked them to find some specific landmarks. And again, look at what was around, what was the layer above, what was the layer below. And so again, by placing it in context, it primed students for the very next topic that kind of consistently followed, which was the actual steps of a physical assessment, keeping these anatomy structures in mind. So there's an example where it's not quite a simulation, but yet it's really interactive. But I know that nursing is really not unique in these challenges of having students explore complex content. So I'd be interested actually to hear some examples from cybersecurity as well.
Yes, Naomi, and cybersecurity as well. There was a need to try to find a way to pull together content from different sources into one place where there's a cohesion, there's in terms of a pedagogical approach, there's a certain uniformity to the presentation. And one way we found to do that was through videos. Just like the courses in the nursing program, we also relied heavily on video, but we took a slightly different approach. So in fact, for starters, high quality video was one of the selling points of the program. And the idea here was to take content that is very technical in nature and that comes from many different sources and references, and to present it in such a way that students would feel that it mattered and was worth watching. Unlike, for example, like a dry and extended lecture of a just talking head on the screen. It also had to be content that stood out because there's a large amount of content out there that students can already learn from. We had to give them something at McGill that they would not be able to get anywhere else. One example is on YouTube. On YouTube, for instance, there are hundreds of tutorials on cybersecurity that cover many of the same topics. And they're great videos. They're created by experts, people with experience in the field. They contain lots of information. They're presented very well. There's humor, there's great visuals. They're really well produced. So the bar was already quite high. For a decade now, YouTube has in many ways been a competitor to academia. It has allowed a great many knowledge workers to share their expertise with the public. And in-depth specialist expertise of that sort had until recently, or until YouTube or other similar platforms, been accessible only in academic settings or other training institutions. And if you look at the number of views that some of the cybersecurity content on these platforms receives, they are rather successful. So the YouTubers were doing something right. One of the things was the length of the videos, for example. It was just right. You could condense into 12 or 15 minutes the same content that a 60-minute lecture would contain. So in order to compete, we had to borrow from those aesthetics, and we had to get our video production to look as good as we could given our means. We used lots of graphics, lots of stock videos, light boards. Most importantly, though, we used a narrative approach with lots of storytelling. Many of the lectures are peppered with anecdotes from the field, stories told by our experts about what it's like to work in cybersecurity, and they offer insider perspectives that are uncommon. This was highly engaging content that some students, as some students reported after the courses, that motivated them to watch more carefully and pay closer attention.
Okay, so we've heard about media-rich content and asynchronous and synchronous simulations, interaction with content, in other words. And so now we'll move on to peer interaction. And our question of the day is, can you share an example of intentionally designed peer interaction and how it supported the course learning objectives, the sharing of knowledge, and the learning experience for students?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. So we talked about simulations already in the context of both nursing and cybersecurity, and those are critical for training. So I wanted to give another example from cybersecurity. Simulations of real-world scenarios exist in general in cybersecurity, and not in as much detail as the ones that you already presented. They're not widely available as training tools yet, so we had to develop some of our own in-house. We wanted students to assume typical management roles in a corporation in this particular scenario that I'm describing. Roles such as Chief Information Security Officer, CEO, somebody representing the legal department, somebody representing customers or clients. And together, they get together as a team to handle a cyber attack simulation. This was supposed to be the last exercise in the graduate certificate, and the culminating project that marks the completion of 5 courses done over 10 intense months. Initially, the simulation was designed as a series of exchanges between the instructor, who would adopt the role of the hacker, and the students, who would act as the board of directors of the organization that I just mentioned. However, it would have been very difficult and inefficient to manage the communications between a single instructor and multiple teams of students. So simulation was the way to go. In this case, it's a hybrid asynchronous synchronous experience, in the sense that individual teams can meet whenever they like together, and they go through the simulation project together. So that's the synchronous aspect. But different teams are free to do it at different times. It doesn't have to happen all at once. They have about a week to complete the whole simulation. The choice to create a simulation allowed us to develop a real-world scenario closely based on several actual cyber attacks. In this way, the project creates meaningful and relevant learning experiences for students, and it focuses on active engagement, on critical thinking, and the application of knowledge in an authentic context. The actual implementation was rather simple. We used a branching scenario to allow the teams to make different choices based on their discussions, and the outcomes of the exercise are very different depending on their choices. It's kind of like a video game. We used, in this case, the technology we used was H5P, which plugs in nicely into Brightspace, although we had to come up with several workarounds because its branching scenario options are limited. And in the future, perhaps some other tools like Captivate or Storyline might have been better.
Thanks, Theo. So in the online program that was developed for nursing, we used H5P in some places too. But we also used VoiceThread, which is what I'd like to talk about a little bit too, because we used it as a tool for promoting peer interaction as well. In one course, for example, we had students record a verbal report, case review presentation. It's a wound care course that's offered as part of the nursing program. And the presentation then gets uploaded to VoiceThread. And then the rest of the class, they were tasked with watching and commenting on each other's presentations. And so what that allowed in this online setting was for students to kind of simulate the sort of case review and discussion sessions. I guess you might consider them, you might talk about them in terms of doing rounds in a hospital setting, that might be part of their everyday practice, but in an asynchronous way. So you had the presentation, and then students could interact with the presentation, ask their questions, and even have a back and forth if that sort of generated, if that happened organically. But certainly they were able to ask questions or give their feedback on the presentation without having to be doing it in real time. It also allowed for different feedback formats. So VoiceThread allows for audio, video, text comments, so students could do whatever they were comfortable with, or whatever time allowed. Like, it just was a very flexible tool to use for this kind of interaction. So that's just one example. I know VoiceThread was used in a few different classes with a great deal of success.
All right, so let me jump in. And another Brightspace integration that we also used was Perusal. We used Perusal to promote peer interaction through asynchronous small group discussions around a patient case for one of the courses that I worked on. The aim was to support social learning and cognitive inquiry. So in a nutshell, Perusal allowed students to have in-depth discussions about the case directly within the case document. So they could do this synchronously or asynchronously, depending on how they wanted to do it. But typically, they didn't have to be present at the same time. So they could annotate the document, ask and respond to each other's questions, and comment on each other's posts, and do it at their own pace. What was nice is this also allows the instructor to view and participate in the discussion, as well as auto-grade students' participation. So all in all, this was an integration into Brightspace, and it was pretty seamless and worked I'd say pretty well.
That's really interesting, Diane. And I just want to circle back to, sometimes we have these ways of supporting peer interaction with great flexibility, but other times you just need to throw them into the same space, a Zoom room, and get them to interact as well for optimizing learning and exchange with course correction in real time. And I think that was what informed one of our design decisions for, again, a clinical competency development course where students needed to practice talking out loud. They could learn from each other's way of framing questions, posing questions, and also kind of challenge each other to explain their rationale, again, in the same setting. So it did require students to set a time for their meeting, but we did provide a lot of structure for these sessions. We call them peer practice sessions. And we provided them with a sample agenda. Students were to take a role for each session. There was a notes page template where they would record their kind of decisions and recommendations for a particular case that they were provided with. And also a peer feedback rubric was developed and provided to students, so they had to formally fill out this feedback rubric in addition to giving that kind of verbal feedback on the spot. This was submitted to the instructor. But of note, the rubric really reflected the way that they were also going to be assessed in the objective structured clinical exams, or OSCEs, which are used a lot in health education. And so it was a way of kind of moving from maybe individual practice in simulations to really starting to talk through their assessment steps and providing that rationale related to a clinical case.
Thank you, Naomi. I'd like to follow up with another question. Based on what you've presented so far, it sounds like asynchronous design was emphasized in the nursing program. And given the nature of the student population and the necessity for flexible learning, that's understandable. However, can you share how you determined when a synchronous session was required? And can you give us some examples?
So it really depended on the content. I would say from a couple of the courses that I was collaborating on designing, when we recognized that there were complex topics, it could have been a clinical ethical dilemma, or it could be really an emotionally distressing topic, such as, family violence or elder abuse, and how to recognize and intervene in those contexts. We felt it was really important that some of those conversations be held in a synchronous format so that support was available, that the instructor could really read the cues of students and offer extra support as needed. And I would say that we've heard from students that they did feel that it was a safe space to have some of those conversations, or maybe unpack some of the, what they were feeling and reflect on that with, again, guidance and support, so that they weren't kind of left to process some of this heavy content completely on their own.
There was also the, I mentioned earlier, the IBL courses. Part of the inquiry-based learning process was knowledge building, and having the students work together to sort of combine, somebody knows something, from personal experience or from their previous clinical experience, and allowing students to share their knowledge to build a base for these patient scenarios that were part of the course. And the courses are pretty intense because they have to work through these scenarios and work through the cycle fairly tight and on a tight schedule. And so having these knowledge building discussions synchronously allowed for the process to happen a bit more quickly, because otherwise if you wait for, all the students to contribute on their own time, and some of them are working days, some of them working nights, all these different things that are impacting, families and whatever. So the process of gathering everybody's knowledge can take quite a while. So by having it done synchronously, it built it a little bit more quickly. It also allowed the instructors to be present to facilitate. They actually called themselves facilitators. And that would allow them to kind of guide the discussion. So if it was going off on a tangent that they didn't particularly want to see, or if they felt that an area wasn't being explored, then they could sort of, give some prompts or inspire the conversation to move in a slightly different direction, whatever that needed to be. So it just all came together to be an important part of the course, and it just wasn't really possible to figure out how to do that asynchronously.
So thanks, Kirsti, for that example. I want to jump in also with another example where we created an online workshop that we adapted from the Kairos blanket exercise workshop. So this is basically a workshop that explores and raises students' awareness of colonialism in Canada and the impact on Indigenous peoples. So during the virtual conference, we used Mural to guide students through the workshop. In Mural, students are placed on an ancestral map and displaced as they progress through history and the impact of colonialism. So this is followed by a guided debrief, a live synchronous online guided debrief and reflection. During the virtual conference, students can also access a private virtual room to debrief if they are triggered and need to speak with someone. So we felt it was really important to provide emotional support and to have that synchronous piece, so that's to accompany students through this process.
So now we've arrived at the third main topic of our conversation today, instructor presence. And it would be interesting to hear if there were common features that were recommended consistently across courses to support instructor presence. As we were doing some of our preliminary conversations for this, we realized that there were some interesting directionality components that we could use to frame our examples today. So I'm just going to set that up really briefly and say one direction is one-way communication from the instructor to the students. There's also two-way communication. So where there's kind of that interaction, maybe more a little bit in real time. And then there's a combo where input is solicited from the instructor or from students by the instructor, so that the instructor can then comment or provide feedback. So with that, I will invite some examples from my colleagues.
there were a lot of strategies that we tried to encourage. And really it was about getting the instructors, if we're talking about that first example, about getting instructors out there in front of students. So we wanted them to some extent take some ownership, but also to make sure that students knew who the person was who is behind the grading and the sort of more concrete instructor components. So we had them do welcome videos to the course as a whole, and then we had them do or we certainly recommended that they do, not everybody did, but we recommended that they do a module intro video for each of the modules within the course, sort of giving their perspective, their take on what's in the module, and even in some cases connecting. We certainly encouraged them to connect to things that were happening in the discussion boards or other things that were happening in the course at that time. So that was a couple things. They also used, there's the announcements feature, and one of the more recent suggestions that somebody has made, which I think is really interesting too, is doing announcements that are video based rather than just a text based announcement. So I think those are all kinds of things that can really help bring the instructor into the course.
Thanks, Kirsti. I agree. We used a lot of the same methods as well in cybersecurity. And it's always a bit of a challenge to get instructors to fulfill their bit in some ways. We can create the environments and the conditions for instructors to interact with students, but the rest is really up to them. And in cybersecurity, for example, we had briefings with instructors before each course, during which we emphasized the need for constant connection to students. We came up with a similar list of suggestions, posting weekly updates from the field, things like news about current cybersecurity exploits, recent attacks, emerging technologies, and so on. And we insisted on these because these kinds of regular updates and interventions can ultimately extend the shelf life of the course. That's another sort of aspect to do this these kinds of one-way communications with students. In cybersecurity, things develop really fast. There's always a new kind of attack somewhere. There's always a new technology. And there are, of course, common principles. So for the courses released this year, for example, we can expect that in about 5 years' time, all of the recent examples that were given by the lecturers will be already old news. However, by combining these examples recorded in previous years to things happening right now in the news, the course facilitator can draw the necessary connections and to highlight those common principles and maintain the relevance of the courses. Additionally, increased teacher presence, as you mentioned, Kirsti, stimulates student engagement. And we could already tell from students' comments that those instructors who regularly posted about the latest news on cybersecurity had a much more productive interaction and much better relationships with the students than those who focused only on delivering the prescribed content.
Yeah, and if I can just add another comment to that, one of the other things that we did, which I thought was interesting to mention, which sort of ties in a way, is we encouraged instructors to bring their personality. Like, so yes, there's the current events piece, but also bring a little bit of your life. You know, if your cat keeps making, popping into your videos, let's celebrate that. Let's, or if you really like emojis, let's use emoji. Like, we encouraged instructors also to try and bring, a little bit of personality.
No, absolutely. I mean, that creates just that extra bit of intimacy that is lacking from in online communications that you can have in face-to-face.
So that's the one-way directional, one-way communication between the instructor and students. And so we also emphasized two-way communication between students and the instructor. So ways to do that we encouraged was to hold open office hours where students could drop in for Q&A periods, or to ask questions and clarify concepts that they didn't understand, or to actually have scheduled Q&A sessions with students.
Thanks for that, Diane. And just to extend a little bit further from the two-way into a bit of a combination is that intentional eliciting input for feedback. And some examples of how we did that is by having perhaps a word cloud activity set up through polling software where students were invited to share some, topical words that came to mind. And then once that was gathered, the instructor could create a video kind of summarizing themes or provide some reflection on what they were observing and connecting it to the content at hand. We also would use primer surveys. So for particular content, kind of capturing students' baseline knowledge or challenging some misconceptions. And again, allowing for the instructor to then have a very focused response to the student body in the course as well. And we also encourage the feedback to be given in multiple formats. So not just a text-based announcement, as Kirsti alluded to earlier, but also providing a short just-in-time video or even an audio clip of their commentary.
Thanks, Naomi. Okay. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. We'd like to thank everybody for sticking with us through this conversation. And we invite you to check out the resources that are associated with this presentation if you'd like to know more.